Okay, ready to dive in. Today, it's Joe Biden. This should be interesting.
Yeah, decades in politics. It's quite the story.
So let's start by rewinding all the way back
Okay.
to the beginning, his early years. I keep seeing this plagiarism incident pop up
Oh, yeah.
from law school
Right.
at Syracuse University College of Law, but it looks like it was cleared by the Delaware Supreme Court.
Yeah, the Delaware Supreme Court's Board of Professional Responsibility, actually.
Okay. Why do you think this keeps coming back to haunt him, even though it was, officially resolved?
Well, I think it just goes to show you the kind of scrutiny that public figures, especially those aiming for the highest office, face. I mean, past actions, even if they're dealt with, they can really stick around in the public's mind.
Right. And it's also interesting, the sources mentioned that Biden initially identified as a Republican
Oh, really?
and even had some clashes with a Democratic governor early in his career. Considering his strong Democratic stance now, it's kind of surprising.
Yeah, that is kind of surprising. It really shows how much the political landscape has shifted, how it's changed over the years.
Yeah.
Back then, things weren't so black and white. Politicians, they were more open to changing positions, even switching parties altogether.
Right.
It kind of shows a certain pragmatism, maybe, in Biden's approach.
Definitely. And then, of course, there's his incredibly long Senate career. From 1973 to 2009, that's a seriously long time in politics.
It is, wow.
What would you say was the most, defining thing about his time in the Senate?
His expertise in foreign policy, definitely. I mean, not just how long he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but how he seemed to form his opinions. It was like based on personal experiences and relationships. Like, that tense 3-hour meeting with Slobodan Milosevic during the Yugoslav wars?
3 hours with Milosevic.
Yeah, it was tense, that's for sure.
I bet. The sources mentioned that Biden opposed the Gulf War.
Okay.
But when it came to the Yugoslav wars, he was really pushing for intervention,
He was a big supporter of that lift and strike policy in Bosnia.
which ultimately helped end the conflict.
Exactly. And it's interesting, Biden considers this work in the Balkans to be his, quote, proudest moment when it comes to foreign policy.
Why do you think that experience in particular stuck with him so much?
Well, I think there were a few things at play. The situation itself was so complex.
Yeah.
The moral obligation to do something. And his personal involvement. He wasn't just like making policy from afar. He was there on the ground, talking with the key people, trying for a peaceful solution.
Makes sense. He also supported the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999.
Right. He did, yeah.
That was pretty controversial at the time.
It was. But it shows that he was willing to use military force, when he felt it was necessary to protect human rights, prevent atrocities.
Interesting. So after all those years in the Senate, he decides to run for president in 1988.
His first attempt.
His first attempt. It seems like his campaign started off pretty well.
It did. He was seen as like this charismatic, relatable guy,
Yeah.
especially for baby boomers, and he was raising a lot of money early on.
But then things kind of unraveled. What happened?
Well, that plagiarism incident from law school came back to bite him.
Oh, right.
And then there were some, let's say, exaggerations about his achievements, his involvement in the civil rights movement. It just created this media frenzy.
Yeah.
Hurts his credibility.
Yeah, that's gotta be tough. It seems like that whole thing really stuck with him. Do you think it affected his decision to run again in 2008?
It's hard to know for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it definitely made him more careful, aware of how intense the scrutiny can be.
Right. In 2008, he focused a lot on his foreign policy experience,
Yeah.
his stance on the Iraq War. I remember he had some pretty pointed remarks about Rudy Giuliani back then.
Oh yeah, that noun, a verb, and 9/11 line
Right.
became pretty famous. It showed a different side of him, a bit more humor, quick wit,
Yeah.
which maybe wasn't as obvious in '88.
But again, it wasn't meant to be. Although it's kind of interesting how his 2008 run led to something else entirely.
Oh, absolutely. It led to him becoming Barack Obama's running mate.
The start of the Obama-Biden era.
I think people really like their dynamic. They seem to genuinely get along.
Yeah, it was a nice change from all the division in politics.
It was. And Biden's foreign policy experience was definitely a big plus for Obama.
Yeah,
I mean, especially since Obama didn't have much experience on the world stage.
right. It brought a balance to the ticket.
Exactly.
Now, the sources don't go into a ton of detail about his time as vice president,
Yeah.
but they do mention that he was very vocal about supporting same-sex marriage,
Oh, yeah, he was.
even before Obama publicly did.
That's right.
Seems like a pretty bold move at the time.
It was. It shows that he was willing to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant, disagreeing with the party line, maybe even upsetting some voters.
Makes sense.
It's interesting how his own beliefs seem to have driven his political choices, even as vice president.
Yeah, he was ahead of the curve on that one, even ahead of the president.
It's worth noting, his public support for same-sex marriage in 2012, it might have even influenced Obama to change his stance.
Really?
It's like a subtle example of how Biden, even as VP, could still have an impact.
Right, shape the conversation.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. His early years, the Senate, 2 presidential runs, and his time as VP. It's clear that even before becoming president, he'd already had this life full of ups and downs.
Oh, absolutely. And it's fascinating how all those experiences, the good and the bad, they shaped him, prepared him for the biggest challenge of all, leading the nation as president of the United States.
So we've followed Biden's path from senator to vice president, and now it's time to really dig into his presidency. He took office facing some pretty huge challenges: the pandemic, political division, economic uncertainty. It was a lot to tackle right away.
Yeah, talk about trial by fire. And you can see how these immediate crises shaped his early moves. He signed a ton of executive orders trying to deal with the pandemic, reversing some Trump-era policies, signaling a different approach to foreign policy.
Like rejoining the Paris Agreement on climate change, that was pretty quick, wasn't it?
First day in office, actually. The Paris Agreement, it's this big international deal aimed at limiting global warming. By rejoining, Biden showed he was serious about climate change and working with global partners on this, crucial issue.
Right. What were some of the main goals of that agreement? I know it involves reducing emissions, but what does that actually look like?
So the Paris Agreement sets a target: keep global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, ideally limited to 1.5 degrees.
Yeah.
Each country, they set their own targets for cutting emissions, working together to reach that global goal. It also includes, financial assistance for developing countries.
To help them make the switch to cleaner energy.
Exactly. Recognizes that climate change is a global problem, needs global action, cooperation.
Gotcha. So back to Biden's early days. He also signed the American Rescue Plan Act, that massive economic stimulus package.
Yeah, $1.9 trillion.
I remember a lot of debate about its impact on inflation, government spending. Did it actually help the country recover from the pandemic's economic fallout?
The American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, it was a huge piece of legislation. Provided direct payments to people, extended unemployment, offered aid to businesses, state and local governments. It definitely gave much needed relief to millions struggling during the pandemic. But its effect on inflation, that's still being argued about.
I see.
Some economists say the influx of money contributed to rising prices. Others say it was just one factor among many.
So a complicated issue with no easy answer. And it's interesting how even those early presidential actions triggered these debates about spending, economic policy, debates that continued throughout his term.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme, with Biden balancing different priorities, navigating a divided political landscape.
Making tough calls with incomplete information.
Exactly.
And he also focused heavily on infrastructure, right? I remember the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act seemed like a big win in such a divided Congress.
It was a major victory for Biden. Billions of dollars for roads, bridges, airports, public transit. Also funding for broadband expansion, investing in clean energy infrastructure like electric vehicle charging stations. It was a serious investment in the country's future and showed that bipartisan cooperation was still possible.
Even on major issues, it seems like climate change was a constant theme for him, from rejoining Paris to the clean energy investments in the infrastructure bill. Did he face any pushback on those efforts?
He did. I mean, there's more awareness of the climate crisis, but there's also resistance, especially from industries tied to fossil fuels. They argue that switching to cleaner energy too fast could hurt the economy, cost jobs. It's a tough balance, addressing climate change while also thinking about the economic side of things.
Absolutely. Now, immigration was another big issue during his presidency. He campaigned on a more humane approach. But there was also a surge in border crossings, leading to criticism from all sides. How did he try to handle that?
Biden aimed for a more nuanced approach to immigration, focusing on root causes of migration, expanding legal pathways for certain groups, reforming the asylum system.
Okay.
But he also faced pressure to maintain border security, address the humanitarian situation there.
Right.
He got criticism from both sides. Some said his policies were too lax, others said they weren't humane enough.
And you mentioned humanitarian parole earlier. That was pretty controversial, wasn't it? Can you explain what that is and why it caused such a stir?
Sure. Humanitarian parole lets people enter the U.S. temporarily for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit, even if they don't meet the normal visa requirements. The Biden administration used it for Afghans and Ukrainians fleeing conflict.
Makes sense.
But they also used it for processing migrants at the southern border, which drew criticism. Some saw it as going around traditional immigration processes.
Seems like it was a temporary fix for an overwhelming situation, but it also raised concerns about the long-term consequences.
Exactly. It shows the ongoing struggle to find workable solutions to a complex, emotionally charged issue like immigration.
And speaking of emotionally charged, Biden also had to deal with the abortion debate, especially after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. That must have been especially tough, given his personal beliefs.
It was. Biden's a devout Catholic, and the church opposes abortion.
Right.
But he's consistently supported abortion rights throughout his career. As president, he promised to protect access to abortion care. His administration took executive actions to soften the blow of the court's decision, but those were limited. The issue remains highly divisive.
It shows how personal beliefs and political realities don't always mesh neatly.
No, they don't. And that dynamic played out in many ways throughout Biden's time in office.
So we've talked about his domestic agenda. The pandemic, economic recovery, infrastructure, immigration, abortion. Clearly a lot of challenges at home. But his presidency was also shaped by a bunch of international crises, starting with the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Yeah, that was a turning point. He'd always wanted to end America's longest war, bring the troops home.
Right.
But the way it was carried out, the chaotic evacuation from Kabul, it was widely criticized, raised questions about his administration's planning, their judgment.
It felt like a big contrast to the optimism at the beginning of his term, that America's back feeling.
It was, and it kind of overshadowed some of his other foreign policy goals, like fixing relationships with allies, getting back into multilateral diplomacy.
Then, just as he's dealing with the fallout from Afghanistan, another crisis hits. Russia invades Ukraine.
That was a defining moment for his foreign policy. He responded strongly with sanctions against Russia, military aid for Ukraine. He rallied international support, presented a united front against Russian aggression.
But he also made it clear he wouldn't send U.S. troops, wouldn't enforce a no-fly zone.
Right. He was firm about not getting into direct conflict with Russia, a nuclear power. He said it could escalate things, lead to a larger war. It was a delicate balancing act, trying to support Ukraine without sparking a bigger conflict.
High stakes, for sure. And it's still going on. And then there were the tensions with China, which seemed to get worse during his presidency, like that whole Chinese spy balloon thing.
Yeah, that was a big deal. Finding that suspected Chinese surveillance balloon over the U.S., it caused outrage, accusations of spying.
Yeah.
It highlighted the growing rivalry between the U.S. and China.
Definitely.
Increased anxieties about China's intentions.
Biden eventually had it shot down, but it definitely strained things between the two countries.
It did. It showed how hard it is to manage such a complex relationship with a rising superpower.
Right.
Biden tried to balance cooperation on things like climate change with competition in trade and technology. It's a relationship that will continue to be a major factor on the global stage.
Absolutely. And then, towards the end of his term, another conflict explodes, the Israel-Hamas war. Given his long-standing support for Israel, that must have been particularly tough.
It was a complex, tragic situation.
Yeah.
Biden condemned Hamas's attacks on Israel, but also called for restraint, protecting civilians. He authorized a lot of military aid to Israel, but also provided humanitarian help to Palestinians.
Trying to walk that tightrope again, supporting an ally while acknowledging the humanitarian crisis.
Right. He was under pressure from both sides. Some pushing for a harsher stance against Hamas, others wanting more protection for Palestinian civilians.
Yeah.
He played a key role in getting a ceasefire, but the root causes of the conflict remain.
So even as he's dealing with all this on the international stage, he's also facing controversies and investigations back home. Like the classified documents case, that went on forever.
Yeah, finding classified documents from Biden's time as VP at his private office in Delaware home, it was a political mess.
It was.
Led to a special counsel to see if any laws were broken, damaged Biden's credibility, gave his critics ammo, especially given all the focus on Trump's handling of classified stuff.
It felt like a dark cloud over his presidency, even though no charges were recommended.
Definitely. Added to the sense that he was struggling to manage things, both at home and abroad.
And then there was that whole House investigation into Hunter Biden's business dealings. It was always in the news.
Oh yeah, House Republicans launched all these investigations into Hunter, focused on his business in Ukraine and China.
Right.
They claimed it raised concerns about conflicts of interest, potential influence peddling. It became a very partisan fight, Democrats defending Hunter, accusing Republicans of a politically motivated witch hunt.
And it led to an impeachment inquiry, right?
It did, but it never went anywhere.
Yeah.
Many saw it as a last-ditch effort to hurt Biden politically, not a genuine attempt at accountability.
And in the middle of all that, he did something that surprised a lot of people. He pardoned Hunter Biden for any federal crimes he might have committed between 2014 and 2024. A blanket pardon, covering a huge range of potential offenses.
It was unprecedented. Pardons usually come after a conviction, but this was preemptive, covering a long period.
Yeah.
Some saw it as a father protecting his son from prosecution. Others called it an abuse of power, shielding his son from consequences.
A controversial decision that will probably be debated for years.
Absolutely. It raises questions about presidential power, the tension between personal loyalty and the law.
So nearing the end of his term, Biden's facing this mix of challenges, international crises, domestic controversies, and the big question of whether he'll run again.
A tough spot to be in. All those challenges weighing on him, and it became clear he was wrestling with the decision of whether to stay in office or step aside.
So we've seen all these challenges, both at home and on the world stage, really shaping Biden's presidency. But as his term was winding down, there was that big question looming. Would he run for a second term?
Yeah, he definitely kept everyone guessing for a while, little hints here and there, all the pundits speculating.
Right.
But no real answer until pretty late in the game.
I can only imagine the pressure. He was already the oldest president we've ever had, facing a ton of criticism, dealing with the aftermath of all those international crises. What do you think were the biggest factors in his decision not to run again?
It was probably a mix of things. Age had to be a factor. Being president is incredibly demanding, physically and mentally. And, those constant attacks from his opponents, often getting pretty personal, that takes a toll.
Yeah.
And then how did those global events affect him? Did he feel like he'd accomplished what he set out to do? Or did those challenges make him wonder if he had the stamina for another 4 years?
It's interesting to think about those private conversations with his family, advisors, everyone close to him. And then finally he ends the speculation, I'm not running. Simple as that.
And just like that, a chapter closes. A chapter with some incredible highs and lows, moments of triumph and, real difficulty.
Absolutely. But it also opens up a whole new set of questions. What does this mean for the Democrats? Who's going to step up and lead the party now?
Right. And how will Biden's presidency be remembered? What will his legacy be? It's too soon to say for sure.
Yeah.
But what are some of the key themes that stand out to you? The successes, the struggles, the things that will probably shape how he's viewed in history.
Yeah, good question.
Well, on the positive side, his commitment to climate change was real. Rejoining the Paris Agreement, investing in clean energy, those were big moves.
Yeah.
He also made progress on the economic recovery after the pandemic, although the long-term effects of his policies are still up for debate.
Right.
And internationally, he tried to repair America's reputation after the Trump years, putting a focus on diplomacy and working with other countries.
But there are those missteps too, moments that kind of tarnished his presidency. The Afghanistan withdrawal, while in line with his belief in ending that war, was really messy and drew a lot of criticism. Pardoning his son, Hunter, well, I can understand it from a father's perspective, but it did raise concerns about fairness and the law. And then there's the whole border crisis, a complex issue with no easy answers. How he handled that is still being debated.
Absolutely.
It seems like his presidency was this mix of ambition and pragmatism, idealism, bumping up against political realities.
He was. He faced such unique challenges both at home and globally. His successes and failures reflect that turbulent time.
So what does all this mean for our listener, the one who requested this deep dive? To me, Biden's story shows that leadership, even at the very top, is complicated, messy.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers, no guarantees.
It highlights how important it is to be informed, engaged in the political process.
Absolutely.
Whether it's voting, talking about these issues, or just staying informed.
Right. We all have a part to play.
Biden's journey, from senator to president. It shows the power of hope and resilience.
He definitely faced setbacks, criticism, but he never seemed to lose sight of what he believed in.
And it's something we can all learn from.
Yeah.
Even when things are tough, we can stick to our values, try to make a positive impact.
So as you continue to learn and explore, remember to embrace the complexity, question your assumptions, and have those tough conversations.
Because really, wanting to understand, to dig deeper, that's what makes a true deep dive so valuable.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into the life and presidency of Joe Biden. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring.